So, as is well known, next year is the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's death, and we will be marking that in Addis Ababa. Sadly, I won't be here at that time, but we have a number of projects in mind. So, for example, we are going to have a play set in a local context, which will be taken around the universities of Ethiopia by a group of players, and there will be a documentary made of this. We are also hoping that we will be able to showcase Shakespeare in some way at big events like our Queen's birthday party in Addis Ababa, but also in Djibouti. So we've got lots of ideas, but the main thing is to mark this very famous commemoration of somebody who is really perhaps the best known literary figure in the entire world. So it's believed that actually the first time Shakespeare was performed in Africa, or strictly speaking just off the coast of Africa, was on a ship called the Red Dragon off Sierra Leone in 1607, where the sailors decided that they were going to perform amateur versions of Hamlet and Richard II to a local audience of chiefs from Sierra Leone. I have no idea how that would have gone down, but of course that was actually during Shakespeare's lifetime. And then it's believed that the first translation of Shakespeare to come to Africa was in 1884, when Othello was performed in Arabic in Egypt. And then during the 20th century, of course, Shakespeare was known in many more countries here. In Ethiopia, it's believed that Shakespeare really started here in secondary education in the Wingate and Sanford schools. And then later on, when the university started, it became part of the higher education curriculum. But the first known performance of Shakespeare on stage here was in 1952, when Julius Caesar was performed by a troupe in front of the Emperor Haile Selassie. Unfortunately, because of the circumstances of Julius Caesar's death, he had to actually be killed behind a curtain because it was considered much too controversial to show that particular scene in front of the emperor. But then subsequently there's been a long history of Shakespeare being performed here, and so for example in 1980 there was a very famous production of Othello here, and I have met the person who played Othello, Abebe Bolcha, and talked to him about this experience. The actor who played Iago was given a very hard time by the audience, who thought he was an appalling man, and they threw shoes at him and even insulted the actor outside in the street. There's also quite a long history here of amateur showings of Shakespeare plays, and I believe, though I don't have all of the history, that Midsummer Night's Dream was performed here, just behind where I'm standing, out in the open air for a very appreciative audience. In other parts of Africa, Shakespeare's been quite controversial. There are those people who say that Shakespeare is somehow not appropriate for Africa because this is the language and literature of another part of the world. But in fact, when one considers the material with which Shakespeare was working, so coups and tragedies and wars and plots, as well as the highest ideals and birth and truth and forward-looking, there are friends of mine in Africa who say actually in some ways what Shakespeare writes about is closer to what is happening in some parts of the continent than it is to events in Europe these days, and so they actually see some resonance in what Shakespeare has to say that's relevant to events today. It's also the case that some very famous translations of Shakespeare have been made into African languages, and perhaps Julius Nyereri's translation of The Merchant of Venice is a particularly famous and well-known one, when he translated the play into Swahili, and there is some evidence that actually African languages have been helped to evolve by such local translations, where new vocabulary and new expressions have been introduced as a result, and it may have even helped to preserve some minority African languages. It's also been a vehicle for people to discuss politics in Africa, but not addressing the political issues directly, but in an indirect way, partly going back to what I was saying a moment ago about the events with which Shakespeare worked.